Hey everyone, it's been a really long time since I've done one of these videos for PvE raid compositions. I think the last time I did one was back around update 33, which is basically 5 patches ago. So yeah, it's been a long time. And since then, nothing has really changed too much, honestly, and that's a big part of the reason why I just never put out another one. Because apart from, a parsing class change and maybe a couple more item sets being added, there wasn't really anything more to add after that video, in my opinion. But yeah, since then, nothing has really changed too much. But with the new chapter coming up for Necrom, with the 7th new class called the Arcanist, along with more item sets coming out from update 37, update 38, I figured, well, why not do this as a refresher? And that's really it. So as usual, some ground rules with these videos. This is not me telling you, oh, you gotta do this, or you gotta have these sets. Oh, your group's gotta do exactly what I have on the sheet or what I talk about, or you'll never succeed. No, the point of the video is to let people critically think and also understand what goes into the thought process behind making a raid composition for trials if they are interested in optimizing a bit more. So you don't have to optimize fully. You can even just take some ideas from these videos and be like, oh, well, why don't we use this set instead of that set for this particular fight because it has better uptime and so forth and so forth. If you want more information on what people are running in terms of skills or even specific gear setups, we could be here all day. So I would definitely point you to esologs.com. Has a bunch of logs that you can just kind of sift through, groups that do submit logs to the website. Other than that, you can also always ask around Discords or ESOU Discord or whatever, apart from that. All right, so just as a refresher, comfort and safety, that's a big thing. Like if most of your group has never ever played DK DPS before and DK DPS is meta, you'll have a pretty long period of time until people are comfortable with it, until people know what they're doing. Also, what's your goal? A lot of raid leads that are left still, they don't really know what their goal is apart from a vague notion of a goal. Like, oh, let's get Godslayer. Okay, how are we going to get Godslayer? Do you want to, be risky? Do you want to play as safe as possible and still get it within the time limit? What's the goal? Second thing, all buffs and debuffs, will kind of go over that strategy in terms of not just itemization, but also how you either compensate the raid composition for content or specifically the itemization for content as well. And of course, let's talk about damage. We'll talk about damage. Damage is king still in ESO ever since I did this first video. So a big emphasis on damage is often needed when you optimize raid compositions. So previously, the general rule was, well, you can have 3 to 4 horns, 2 to 3 colossi, or a turning tide. We're going to give it a turning tide actually here. And you can actually have 2 colossi, and I'll actually explain that in a bit, meaning 2 necromancers. Player load is going to be a concept we talk about when we talk about support DPS itemization. Critical damage cap is still 125%, so you should always customize for your group and spec. Antari still has his calculator up for you to use. For example, you can not only look up how much penetration you would have with all these buffs and stuff, and class passives, you can also see exactly where you would end up. In terms of critical damage, if you are not just in a group, but also wearing specific things like Harpooner's Waiting Kill. What's your major force uptime in your group? What's your minor brittle uptime? That increases your critical damage taken on the boss. Do you have a Shadow Mundus? Really nifty calculator tool I would use definitely to figure out where you're at. There's no real point going over 125% as a DPS. If you do by like 2-3%, whatever, no big deal. But if you're getting like 150%, 145% or something like that, you should probably review your setup, like champion points. For example, like previously as a stamina DK, do you really need both minor force and fighting finesse, assuming a certain uptime on major force? So maybe you can look at taking out fighting finesse or backstabber for certain fights or for certain groups. Okay, so class-wise, nothing has really changed, right? Dragon Knights can still offer these unique debuffs and buffs. Stagger from Stone Giant, Minor Brutality from an Earth and Heart ability, Engulfing Flames, Igneous Weapons. These are all still staples that raid groups still use up to this day. Templar still offers minor sorcery. The minor fraction breach is not relevant as much anymore because they gave Pierce Armor the tank skill minor breach as well. Nightblade still offers minor savagery. Apart from that, it's always been sort of a damage class during Nightblade metas. Right now, it's not really a Nightblade meta. Necromancer, we still have the major vulnerability from Necromancer, which is significant. Empower is also kind of out right now. I'm going to cross off just in case it comes back. Empower isn't really needed because of the changes that they made for Empower, I believe in update 36, PvE. So no real need for a Necromancer tank to keep up Empower. Right now, you're bringing Necromancer tanks and stuff like that to mitigate certain bleed damage in certain trials or fights, like Boss A hard mode. Also, we have the new BDSR Teleria hard mode, right? And then we have the Warden, still gives minor toughness, extra 10% more max health to everybody. The Warden healer is healing. Major Resolve, they buffed the range of it in update 35 or 4, and it's even easier to keep up now. Sorcerer, we have Minor Prophecy. Crystal Weapon is still kind of a consideration depending. And of course, we're going to talk about Major Berserk, which is going to be a more consistent addition that the combat developers have made. For update 38, they're going to make it so when someone synergizes a Storm Atronach ultimate from the Sorcerer, it gives a Major Berserk to basically everybody in the group for 10 seconds, which is pretty significant because they not only buffed the amount of people with effects, but also the duration from 8 seconds to 10 seconds. Here we have the Arcanist. Arcanist is kind of a weird spot right now, but it does still offer a unique source of minor courage, which typically comes from a set like Yonakrin, right? And of course, it has that unique glyphic ultimate where it does grant your group potentially a new source of weapon and spell damage that is not a named source, really, when you have it stacked up with igneous weapons or stuff like that. All right, so support itemization, nothing has really changed again for the most part. It's just become a bit more cluttered yet again. It's over the past several patches, it's been like, okay, there's this really cool support set that might be really good. How are we going to fit it onto our supports? They're already overwhelmed with all these support sets that they already have to run. So you have to think more carefully about it, or not even more carefully, but you have to consider that it's quite much more open now in terms of how you rearrange or arrange the itemization for your support rules. So we still have Roaring Opportunist, Situational, Powerful Assault, Pearlescent Ward, Pillagers, Tremor, and Kratos, Ozezon, Inferno, Olo SPC for your Major Courage, Saxleos is still there, Yorvolds to combine with the Roaring Opportunist. Yonakrin, probably not much anymore for update 38 because of Arcanist. Crimson Oath's Arrive is a big one. Alkosh, which usually is shared with the DPS, typically, not really a support set anymore. Arc Druid, it's a really, really strong set, and part of the reason why we can get away with 2 Necros or 2 Colossi now. We have Pearls of Alnophay, which is still good, post-nerf. Symphony of Blades. Of course, you got to figure out who's keeping with the Minor Brittle. Is it one in tanks? Is it an Arcanist, potentially? Because Arcanists do also have a unique source of Minor Brittle that's really, really consistent to keep up without the need for ice staves or something like that. So that's also a consideration. We do have some really, really niche sets apart from the Master's Resto, which can be pretty standard depending on your setup for things like an RO, Yorvolds, 1 Magnum Incarnate, 1 Master Resto, something like that, with 1 Spotter. So DPS itemization has changed a little bit as well. Obviously, we're not going to be running Boss A or anything anymore. A lot of people keep asking me, is Boss A good? No, not really. They changed the scaling of Boss A as a reminder, and compared to Boss A, Coral is not only easier, but also, I believe, has a different scaling to it, which is why Coral comes out ahead as the other set for medium armor DPS. For the most part, your DPS will be in at least 5 to 6 medium armor pieces, and these are all the sets that are, can be used situationally and of course optimally depending, is it a single target fight that where the target stands still? Maybe you can go with Reliquant and Pillar with something else like Harpooners, right? Is it a fight where the target does stand still, but you take the DPS takes frequent direct damage, right? So maybe Harpooners isn't good because you need to maintain the Harpooner stacks, right? Is it a fight where it's mobile? Well, okay, maybe we can keep up Reliquant stacks still on a moving target, but probably not Pillar of Nirn because Pillar of Nirn is stationary AoE, so maybe we can go with Advancing Yokeda instead. What's the class? Is it a Templar? Is it an Arcanist? Maybe you can consider Deadly Strikes. And on and on and on, right? Flame Blossom is a very recent set. Sorare was changed as well recently. So those are two things for consideration. I believe Flame Blossom is not only good for certain packs of trash, but it's also really good for targets that have pretty big hitboxes. Sororia, they did buff it a bit. So that will really depend on the fight because you do, for the most part, don't want to miss out on Sororia stacks by moving around too much. There are two new trial sets for DPS that are kind of coming out. Onsoul's Torment might be good in certain scenarios, but for the most part, I haven't really found those scenarios just yet. It may depend on the group and the content, sort of one of those things. Peace and Serenity might be okay for VA's hard mode, for people struggling to basically stay alive or sustain in VA's hard mode. But again, that's also really dependent on your group as well. Shared sets mean on this spreadsheet or sheet, these are sets that are shared between DPS and supports. So Elemental Catalyst, sometimes you see it on your main tank in certain fights, like Sunspire maybe, or VA's hard mode. Zen's Redress, sometimes depending on the composition, maybe a healer is wearing it, or depending on the positioning of the healer, where the healer can't get to anybody else, like in VA's hard mode, kite healing, the healer is wearing it. MK, same thing. Spalter Ruin. Spalter Ruin is very dependent on who can provide the highest uptime on it. So if a tank is on the other side, away from the group, probably their Spalter will not hit the group. So you need someone in group to hit, to have Spalter on, so that Spalter affects as many people as possible, right? So sometimes you see Spalter Ruin shift to a healer or a DPS or the off tank who may be in a more favorable position than the main tank. Master Architect and War Machine are still staples. I saw a weird comment in the ESO Discord the other day where people were like, "Well, I've never seen people use them, or aren't they irrelevant?" No, they're very relevant. It really depends on whether your one of your healers can run Roaring Opportunist in your Volds. There will be some fights, especially with the new trial, where they can't. So it's also really good for opening burst fights. For example, like VS Hard Mode, Refabrication Committee as well, and so forth. Ring of the Wild Hunt, that's kind of more for, just traveling between trash to trash, depending on how far it is. Morok Tong, again, situational in your composition and stuff like that. Alkosh is more, again, for DPS. Elfbane sometimes maybe for DK DPS, depending. And of course, here we have the calculations for medium armor and light armor DPS. We've added the Arcanist as well. So for the most part, you want to hit as close to 18,200 penetration as possible. If you're at 18,100, whatever, right? If you're at 20,000 average, maybe you can take a look. It's okay to overpen as long as you yourself, you're not building for that overpenetration. Because you can shift other resources like your champion points, slottables from, Fighting Finesse to Wrathful Strikes instead of keeping Fighting Finesse. Not Fighting Finesse, Force of Nature, right? So there's a lot of things you have to look at. And of course, Antari's calculator has that as well. And for CP, I don't really talk about this too much, but I figured I might as well because I've been seeing some people not talk about them at all. So DPS CP typically consists, depending on the class, of Master at Arms, Biting Aura, Thaumaturge, Deadly Aim, Fighting Finesse, Backstabber, Exploiter. Force of Nature is sometimes occasionally maybe used, but you shouldn't really need it, honestly, if you're really optimized. Healer CP, this is also something not a lot of people talk about. Healer CP. So one healer should have Enlivening Overflow, which will help with the sustain for the DPS. And then you'll have From the Brink on another healer, which will help the survival of DPS. So, and that's really it in terms of the numbers. Of course, we are still in the hybridization sort of, I don't know what to call it, meta hybridization process of the game of ESO. So remember that, just because, remember that weapon and spell crit, your damage or whatever is based on the higher of the two. So you can have weapon crit, right, being higher than spell crit, but you can have spell damage also higher than weapon damage, and that will work. So it doesn't have to be any more weapon crit with weapon damage. It can be spell damage with weapon crit or spell crit with weapon damage. Okay, quick notes. What about Vampire? So still, even after all this time since the last video, you'll probably still use Exhilarating Drain, or maybe in very, 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 very rare case, Simmering Frenzy as a DPS. So Exhilarating Drain is more meant for support, usually a tank. And usually tanks can get away with it depending on the fight, like Cloud Rest. Misform is, of course, still kind of like non-existent for PvE for the most part. Weapon setups, enchantments, kind of the same thing for DPS. You can do dual wield staff. You can do dual wield two-hander. Right now, a lot of people are preferring dual wield staff for most scenarios. You can go bow, should be fine. I have found staff to be kind of underwhelming for, I don't know what's going on with the math there, but I would definitely say bow is way more worth than the staff if you're going to go range DPS. Okay, and of course skill setups can affect your itemization, and you got to think about food for different fights. Potions, heroism potions for sure if you're going to really optimize and have a DK tank give you igneous weapons, and you have Camel Hunter for the minor berserk, and of course the minor crit. You also should probably consider the fact that not every class can run heroism potions, like Sorcerer. Sorcerer is kind of weird in the sense that they don't have enough bar space for Camel Hunter and things like that. So yeah, just a heads up on that one. Next, let's talk about what you're probably here for. Oh, actually, before we talk about that, I completely forgot about this, even though I highlighted this to remind myself. So a lot of people will be asking, probably, Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet, which is one of the new mythics coming out with Necrom, versus Mora's Whispers versus Harpooner's Waiting Guild. So Mora's Whispers and Harpooners is similar in the sense that they do offer basically the not equivalent, but the same types of stats, critical damage and crit chance. For trash, if you have a group, if you are in a group where you're going from trash to trash, or you're in a trial where that's even possible, right? You go from one trash pack to the other or to the next without much of a break in between, Harpooners is definitely nice. Mora's is nice for those instances where DPS might be taking too much direct damage, and that's unavoidable. So that will affect their Harpooner's Waiting Guild stacks. So maybe Mora's Whispers is better. But now Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet has entered the conversation. And Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet not only gives a minor force, which is not a unique critical damage modifier, so it has that not going for it compared to Mora's Whispers and Harpooners, but it might be good in terms of just having minor force without needing to cast Channel Acceleration for trash fights. It also does offer unique amount of penetration, about 1600, and it does give you 50% more damage done to just monsters in general, which is pretty significant. So I can see scenarios where you will probably wear Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet for trash scenarios, as opposed to either Mora's Whispers or Harpooners. And of course, for the Arcanist DPS coming out, Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet is basically best in slot for everything, for everywhere, just to do the nature of the class. So yeah, I mean, also maybe depending on the fight as well, where light attacks and stuff like that aren't as important, because right now they're capped at a certain point, and also they just may not matter depending on the fight. You can still probably go with Velothi Herb Mage's Amulet for boss fights as well, not just trash fights. All right, the part you guys were all probably waiting for, let's talk about support composition, DPS composition, itemization, and stuff like that. Okay, so this part is really old, so just kind of ignore this. But the kind of same concepts are there. I'll kind of go over what sets or setups are available. in terms of optimizing your raid composition. So in terms of your support comp, class-wise, it's going to be Warden, Healer, probably Arcanist Healer for most scenarios, a DK tank for that stagger and igneous weapons, of course. That'll probably never go away ever, unless you change those skills. And of course, we have the Necromancer tank or Flex tank, depending on what the off tank needs to do or has to do. So you could have a potentially Sork off tank, potentially. You could have the Arcanist off tank as well. So yeah, the Arcanist healer is going to be there because of Minor Courage. And their Minor Courage comes from a ground-based AoE that a tank may not be able to put onto the group, depending on the trial, fight, and so forth. I'm sure you're tired of me saying that right now. Support sets will include Ozezon, Powerful Assault, Master Architect, Pearls, Master's Resto, Spalter. Again, Spalter is situational between who gives the most uptime on it. Saxleal, War Machine, Master Architect, RO Yorvolds, SPC Pillagers with Pearls and Symphony. You'll definitely have Crimson Oaths, depending on the fight. Is it a multi-boss fight? Is it Trash Pack? And so forth. Tremor Scale, Incratus, Pearlescent, Crimson. So when we remove Yonakrin, we can basically kind of safely be adding things like Pearlescent Ward to the support itemization, since if you have an Arcanist, you don't need Yonakrin because Arcanist gives Minor Courage. And these are some examples of setups you can do for healers. For healers, it will really depend on whether a healer can keep up RO Yorvold. Some trials they may not be able to, some fights they may not be able to. So in that case, maybe one healer has to go Master Architect or War Machine for the Mage's Slayer, while one person from the DPS composition goes War Machine or Master Architect. And this will make more sense when you look at the DPS composition. So for Update 38, I would definitely say between the Nightblade and Sorcerer, because right now it's Nightblade Healer and not Arcanist Healer. Probably Nightblade will be phased out, almost basically completely out of a typical composition. Because, again, thinking about hybridization, you only need Minor Prophecy. You don't really necessarily need Minor Savagery and Minor Prophecy, right? So you'll probably keep the Sork, just because the Sork now also gives Major Berserk to all the people in the group. So yeah, and then you'll have two Necromancers, right? Because two Necromancers, you can get away two Necromancers now because of Arch Druid, which can be typically put on the tank, usually. I forgot to put that there. And of course, we do have the Parse classes right now. Even for Update 38, DK is pretty good. I would say Templar is better than DK for some fights because of Beam and, of course, nature of Templar. So I've seen a lot of groups bring Templar to some trials, including VAS Hardmoon. DK doesn't really do well in those kinds of fights where they have to go ranged. I do think Arcanist is going to be pretty damn good in content, especially for multi-target fights, multi-boss fights. Just fights in general where if they can go, for the most part, uninterrupted in their beaming, a lot of things are going to melt. There's going to be a lot of burst damage. So I think between DK Arcanist and DK Templar, and that's pretty much it, really, for the most optimal classes. Again, I'm not saying this to say, oh, don't bring your Warden DPS to raids. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this is just for if you want to go really, really, really far and really, really high in terms of like optimization. These are just ideas, right? So don't take it too seriously. Anyway, in terms of DPS itemization, we have EC Alkosh on Necro. That's been getting more and more popular. I've been a EC MK Necromancer as well, so that's also a possibility you can do. Again, talking about like player load, I personally don't like putting way too many support DPS sets on one DPS. It's better to, at least mathematically, to spread them out a little bit. So for example, you would have Zens on DK. You can do Zen's Alkosh DK, but what if you just shifted the Alkosh run a little bit to even do EC Alkosh? Maybe EC Alkosh will be a DPS gain, in fact, for the EC user, because EC is light armor and Alkosh is medium armor. So that's the math there. In Kratos, sometimes, yes, a DPS will or can wearing Clattuc depending on the monster sets the supports need to wear. Are both tanks filled on monster sets like Arc Druid plus Tremor Scale, right? So you can't do in Clattuc. So you need to have someone else having Clattuc, whether it's a healer or a DPS. Other than that, you can do staggers and DK still. I personally would not. And of course, we do have things like, oh, what about EC Spotter? Yeah, that's also a thing too. Usually on the Necromancer, so I'm not exactly sure what's here, but yeah, I mean, you do that. MK right now, from what I know and from what I've seen and from what I've done, I think most teams are going with either a ECMK or MK, just the MK DPS. Usually a Crow as well. So Necromancers are definitely just kind of in the support DPS category because DKs and Templar and probably Darkness is going to outparse them pretty high. And major vulnerability is still significant, so you'll still have at least 2 Necromancer DPS in group, most likely. In terms of DPS itemization, I kind of talked about that already, so we're going to skip it. Plague Break, by the way, if you're using Plague Break right now, it is being changed for update 38 Necrom, so it's only going to be useful in PvP. Azure Blight is still going to be pretty good situationally for both Trash and certain boss fights where there might be a lot of adds. VA's Dual Wield for Trash is optional. It's not exactly the best, but it's definitely up there. BRP Dual Wield, 6 medium, 1 light is typically the armor setup or armor weight setup. And a lot of you have asked me for a heavy attack composition. And this is with DPS wearing, for the most part, Oaken Soul with Stormmaster, 1 Slime Crawl, and Sergeants, despite the adjustments to Stormmaster and stuff like that for update 38. This is still the best trial setup for a heavy attack composition. And what you can do, actually, is pretty interesting with a heavy attack composition. You can do RO Urvolds on the Necromancer DPS support. It does, it's not the greatest DPS setup, but still, you are basically overloading your support composition with more of the item sets that are usually spread out across these people, right? You got to squeeze in more sets onto the supports if everyone here can't wear things like EC or War Machine or Alkosh, or Zens, or MK. So you're going to see your support sets typically take on the heavy load of the support DPS itemization. So here you have things like on the tank, you have Tremor, Crimson, Elemental Catalyst. On another tank, you have Sax, PA, and Incratus. And on the healer, you have MK Zen and Arc Druid. And of course, for another healer, you can do Nazarite, Pillagers, Pearl, and SPC. So in one way, it is a little less stressful on the healers to heal a heavy attack composition with this setup because all the DPS are really tanky with Oaken Soul and the Sergeant's Mails for the most part. And while that is one less stressful thing to take note of, especially as a healer, you still need to maintain those uptime. So I don't know if it's like an even trade. But yeah, you can have a Necro Rojo. The Necro DPS can be a flex slot for maybe other potential item sets. And of course, everybody else is a heavy attack Sorc or Parse class, such as, I don't know, heavy attack DK, heavy attack Necromancer, and heavy attack Templar hit pretty high as well. So yeah, that's really it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the return of the PvE raid compositions and our talks here in this video about the usual stuff, the usual rules. But yeah, this is what I think is, and have surmised, is going to happen in terms of like at least the class setups. So yeah, let me know down in the comments below if you have any questions, and I'll try to get to you. Thanks for watching.